As I noted last time, there really does seem to be an interesting red and blue divide in our nation. Over the last 6 or 8 presidential elections, voters in the big cities along the coasts in New England and in the Great Lakes region have really tended to vote heavily for Democratic candidates, whereas the rural and central and southern parts of the country have tended to vote for Republican candidates. Now, the readings for this week are from Stan Greenberg's book on what he calls the two Americas. Stan Greenberg was Bill Clinton's pollster and has run a national political opinion polling firm for several decades. Very interesting fellow. Greenberg argues in the book that over the last half century, we've really developed a system where about a third of the states reliably vote Democratic, about another third reliably vote Republican, and about a third can swing either way in a given election. As of the 2004 election in Greenberg's telling, there was rough parity across the country in terms of voters identifying with one party or another party's candidate, and with maybe 10% of the electorate in the independent or swing voter category. In the 2008 election, the combination of Obama's message, the disgruntlement over the Bush presidency, the weakness of the McCain candidacy, and the financial crisis that began in September of the election year, 2008, really moved most of the independent voters firmly into the Democratic camp. But then in 2010, there was a huge move backwards toward the Republican camp in the congressional races, such that the GOP took back the House and gained seats in the Senate. By the way, if you're interested, here's what the red-blue shift has looked like over time, going all the way back to the 1932 election. You can see at the bottom right-hand corner where the Democrats won most parts of the nation pretty easily there for a number of elections when Franklin Roosevelt was president or the chief candidate for the Democrats. Now, Harry Truman just barely squeaked by in 1948. Then the map shifted to red when Dwight Eisenhower was president, famous war general. The Democrats picked up the White House again under John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson in 1960 and 64. Then we had a whole string of Republican victories that were really only interrupted by Carter in 1976, and then the Bill Clinton victories in 1992 and 96. And of course, that takes us up to Obama's election in 2008. I'm not really sure what the long-term picture is going to look like, but my guess is that 2012 will be a fairly close election and that the electoral map will not look that terribly different from what it did in 2008. Now, what you have in the Greenberg readings in his report is really a report on a huge amount of opinion and demographic data. Essentially, his firm polled thousands of voters over the span of about a year and a half following 9/11, and also conducted a whole host of focus group sessions all across the country. So part of the methodology here was to get a sense for how people responded to a number of what Greenberg calls thermometer issues. So, for example, the pollsters were especially interested in how people reacted to topics like Bill Clinton, the status of immigrants in the country, the North American Free Trade Agreement, the National Rifle Association, and pro-life groups. These were sort of proxies for whether voters harbored conservative or liberal or centrist views or some combination of these things. But in addition to political views on about 15,000 voters, the pollsters also had a pretty detailed demographic set of data on all of the participants, which means that they could slice and dice the data to find out which subgroups of the population held red views or blue views or fell somewhere in between. And that's what makes this whole thing fairly interesting. So here's what Greenberg found. The segment of the electorate that makes up the core of the red or conservative voters really looks like this. And remember, this is somewhere between maybe 33 to 40% of the voters nationwide. The largest chunks of this group involve what Greenberg calls the faithful, or these would be evangelical Christian voters. And many of these would be people who attend non-denominational churches or megachurches. Now, this also includes country people, folks living in rural areas, and other folks from the Deep South, as well as people in the far-out suburbs, or what are sometimes called the exurbs. And these are the the areas outside the traditional suburban rings around big cities. Big cities often have suburbs that run sort of 10 to 20 miles outside the main core of the city, but then beyond that is the exurbs. Now, these all tend to be independent people who embrace self-reliance. They generally don't look to government to help them out very much. Now, I would point out that there's some irony here because a lot of the people who live in rural and southern areas tend to be actually quite dependent upon government programs of one sort or another. So, for example, from Social Security to disability benefits to government subsidized pension programs to agriculture subsidies. In fact, if you look at it this way, the red states tend to be those that on the whole actually receive more back from the federal government in terms of tax revenues than they send to Washington, D.C., which is really quite interesting. Now, a portion of this group is also privileged men, and these folks may be simply voting for conservatives not because they believe in the social program of conservatives, but just to keep their tax rates low and the government out of their affairs. Now, I hope you're intrigued by the groups that Greenberg calls the FU boys and the FU old men. The former tend to be high school dropouts who really hate the man, but don't have very much going for themselves. The latter group tends to be World War II era people who often, sit around coffee shops and sort of rail against the government. But a lot of these people, ironically, have benefited quite a bit from government, probably more than they realized or want to admit. Now, on the other side are the true blue Democratic loyalists, and these tend to be this group includes African Americans who have voted almost monolithically, and here I'm talking about 90% or higher for Democrats, really ever since the 1964 election and Lyndon Johnson, who had just pushed through the Civil Rights Act that year. Hispanics have also voted pretty heavily for Democratic candidates, although portions of them can be pulled away from Republicans. The core constituencies here for the Democrats, as Greenberg discusses, are really people from urban, multi-ethnic, so-called cosmopolitan states. And these would be places like New York or New Jersey, Massachusetts, California, Washington, or Oregon. And also people he calls secular warriors. And we might consider these folks the counterparts to the evangelical voters, people who want to see religious voters and their values marginalized in the political system. And also people who are in union families. That's another kind of core constituency here. Now, interestingly, this category also includes what he calls super educated women. And these are women with graduate or professional degrees. And a great many of them presumably feel like their success in the workforce is really dependent upon government protection of things like abortion rights and services, as well as government protection of women in the workforce in general. Now, Greenberg's material is really quite interesting, but it's getting a little bit dated, and 10 years down the road, fewer and fewer people have strong reactions, for example, to Bill Clinton's presidency. Nor do we talk much about the North American Free Trade Agreement or the Internet, at least not in the ways that Greenberg's pollsters use these terms. So in my classes on campus, we often talk about some more recent issues and what these might connote for blue voters and red voters. And here's a list of some of those issues on this particular slide. Now, remember what this red-blue divide is really about is what people believe to be the proper role of government in folks' lives. What should that role be? Should government be used to try to spin out a vision for the way that we should live? Should government protect people from scarcity or force people to get along with one another? Or should government just be a kind of referee, enforcing the ground rules and basically allowing people and businesses to carry out their lives with a minimum of interference, sort of allowed to develop their own philosophies of life and their own forms of interaction and commerce? The nature of red and blue and Republican and Democratic parties will shift over time, but these fundamental questions, I think, will remain with us for the indefinite